What happens when a strict librarian, who spent years enforcing silence, scolds the wrong person, someone who could destroy her career with just a single word. Imagine the shock of realizing you've just yelled at the person who owns the entire library system, and you have no idea. Stay tuned to see how a simple mistake turns into a life-changing lesson for both of them. It was a quiet afternoon at the town library, the kind of day where the sun barely peeked through the blinds, casting soft rays across the rows of books. The place smelled of old pages and coffee, a familiar scent to anyone who spent time there. Most patrons were engrossed in their reading, careful not to break the sacred silence that ruled the room. But today, something was different. A loud voice broke the tranquility. "Excuse me, can I get some help here?" The librarian, Mrs. Thompson, looked up from behind her desk, her sharp eyes narrowing at the source of the disturbance. Across the room, a young man was sitting at a table, a book open in front of him. He wasn't shouting, not really, but his voice was louder than what was considered acceptable in her domain of peace. Mrs. Thompson had worked in this library for over 20 years, and she knew the rules. No loud talking, no disruptions. Silence was sacred. She stood up, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her glasses, then marched toward the table with a look of determination. As she approached, the young man didn't even notice her at first. He was reading aloud, a habit he hadn't outgrown. His voice carried across the room, though it wasn't quite at the level of a yell. It still felt like a violation in the quiet space. Mrs. Thompson stopped beside his table and cleared her throat. He glanced up at her, still unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. She put her hands on her hips and, with a stern voice, said, "Excuse me, young man, but you're disturbing the peace. This is a library, not a theater. Please keep your voice down." The young man blinked at her in confusion, clearly not expecting the reprimand. He tried to explain. "I'm just reading to myself, not causing any trouble." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't having it. Her eyes were fixed on him, as if she were some kind of enforcer, and she didn't take kindly to anyone breaking the rules. She raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms. "Well, your reading is loud enough to be heard across the room. Please, keep it down. Some of us come here for peace and quiet." Her tone was sharp, and he could sense that she wasn't going to back down. He frowned, the hint of frustration appearing on his face, but he nodded and muttered, "Okay, I'll keep it down." Yet, as he began to return to his book, Mrs. Thompson stood there, still watching, making sure he followed her command. It wasn't just about enforcing silence. For her, it was about keeping the order, the very thing she prided herself on. But little did she know, this was only the beginning of an encounter that would change everything. Mrs. Thompson stood there for a moment longer, arms still crossed, waiting for him to get the message. She had a way of making people feel small, even if it wasn't her intention. Most students learned quickly not to test her patience, but the young man just shrugged, and with a sigh he turned his attention back to his book. Mrs. Thompson, satisfied that he was no longer disrupting the peace, started to walk back to her desk. But before she could take 2 steps, she heard it. A voice, not raised in anger, but calm and deliberate, saying, "You should know who I am before you try to teach me a lesson." Mrs. Thompson froze. She hadn't expected anyone to speak to her like that. Her eyes flicked back to the young man, whose face was no longer filled with frustration, but with an odd kind of calm confidence. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Mrs. Thompson felt a little uneasy. She hadn't noticed anything unusual about him. He seemed like just another student, perhaps a bit too relaxed for the setting, but that was it. Still, his tone was different now, almost like a challenge. "Excuse me?" she said, turning back toward him, her voice sharper than before. The young man didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly closed the book in front of him and placed it on the table with a soft thud. His gaze locked onto hers, unwavering. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he said again, his voice almost too calm for the situation. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to know who you are to know the rules of this library. I'm in charge here," she said, the authority in her voice firm and resolute. The young man smirked, as if he knew something she didn't. "You think you're in charge of this place?" he said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "But that's about to change." Her patience, already thinning, snapped. "I don't have time for games, young man. If you're going to keep causing a scene, I'll have to ask you to leave." She took a step closer, eyes fixed on him, but there was a small, unexpected flutter of doubt in her chest. Something about his calm demeanor, his boldness, made her feel uneasy. "Leave?" he repeated with a chuckle. "You don't even know the half of it." There was something unsettling about the way he said it. Mrs. Thompson felt a strange, uneasy feeling creep up her spine, but she quickly brushed it off. After all, she was the librarian, the one who kept the rules, who made sure everything ran smoothly. No one ever got the best of her, not even a student who thought he could act as if he had the upper hand. She turned on her heel and walked back to her desk, thinking that was the end of it. But as she sat down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. That brief exchange had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She tried to focus on her work, but the words, "You don't know who I am," kept echoing in her mind. Meanwhile, the young man just sat there, waiting. It was as though he knew exactly how this story was going to unfold. The minutes passed, and Mrs. Thompson tried her best to focus on the stack of papers in front of her. But the encounter with the young man kept nagging at her thoughts. She couldn't get over that strange feeling. The way he'd spoken to her, the way he'd challenged her authority so easily. She'd dealt with plenty of unruly students before, but none of them had ever made her feel so unsure. She glanced back at the young man, who was still sitting at the table, flipping through pages of his book. There was something almost too serene about him, like he was waiting for something. A moment later, Mrs. Thompson shook her head and decided to put it out of her mind. After all, what harm could a little miscommunication cause? But then, just as she was about to settle into her work again, the library door opened, and in walked a man in a suit. He was tall, with a sharp, businesslike air about him. Mrs. Thompson barely looked up, assuming he was just another visitor. But then, as the man walked past her desk, he paused and turned to her with a polite smile. "Excuse me, is Mr. Carter here?" he asked. Mrs. Thompson furrowed her brow. "Mr. Carter?" she repeated, not sure who he was referring to. "Yes, Mr. Carter. I believe he's here for a meeting," the man replied smoothly. The mention of the name made Mrs. Thompson's eyes widen for just a second, but she quickly covered it with a smile. "I'm not sure who that is," she said, giving him a polite but firm look. "Perhaps you could check with the circulation desk?" The man seemed undeterred by her response and nodded with a small smile before walking toward the back of the library. Mrs. Thompson returned to her work, but now she couldn't shake the sense that something was strange about the whole situation. She looked at the young man again, who was still sitting there, completely at ease. He was flipping through his book, but his eyes were glancing up occasionally, as if he were waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, the man in the suit reappeared, but this time he was no longer alone. He was accompanied by another man, slightly older, and both of them were heading straight toward the young man at the table. Mrs. Thompson blinked in confusion. What is going on here? Before she could even process what was happening, the man in the suit leaned down toward the young man at the table and spoke quietly to him. Mrs. Thompson could barely make out the words, but she caught the mention of a name. "Mr. Carter, we've been waiting for you." Her heart skipped a beat. Mr. Carter? The same name the man had asked about? This couldn't be the same person, could it? The young man, Mr. Carter, looked up from his book and smiled calmly. "I'm sorry. I must have missed the meeting time. Let me just wrap things up here." He stood up slowly, gathering his things as if this was all just part of a normal day for him. But for Mrs. Thompson, the world seemed to tilt slightly. The man in the suit nodded and smiled. "No rush. We're just happy you could join us, sir." Her mind raced. The young man, Mr. Carter, had just been casually reading in the library like any other student, and now here he was, apparently involved in some kind of important meeting. But it wasn't just the situation that was strange. It was the sudden realization that something was horribly wrong. She didn't know who he really was, but one thing was becoming painfully clear. This was no ordinary student. Mrs. Thompson's chest tightened as the pieces began to fall into place, and she suddenly felt the weight of the situation on her shoulders. She had just yelled at a person she didn't recognize, a person who seemed to hold far more power than she had ever imagined. The truth began to dawn on her slowly, but it was already too late. The damage had been done. Mrs. Thompson stood frozen behind her desk, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just unfolded. She watched as Mr. Carter, the Mr. Carter, gathered his things with calm precision, completely at ease in the midst of her confusion. The suit-clad men, still smiling and nodding, began to escort him toward the back of the library. But she couldn't look away. Something in the way they spoke to him, like he was some kind of VIP, sent a wave of disbelief through her. She'd just scolded him for being too loud, treating him like a troublemaker. The sharp, uncomfortable reality hit her like a ton of bricks. That's it. He's someone important. But who? And why hadn't she recognized him? She thought back to their earlier exchange, the way he'd spoken to her, so confidently, as if he knew exactly how things would unfold. "You don't know who I am." The words echoed in her mind. Why had he said that? How could he have known she didn't know who he was? As the men and Mr. Carter disappeared down the hallway, Mrs. Thompson finally managed to blink, feeling a rush of heat creeping up her neck. What had she done? It wasn't just a simple mistake, not like she'd scolded a regular student. She had made an error that felt monumental. She tried to shake off the panic rising in her chest and glanced around the room, but her thoughts were too loud. The quiet that once felt so familiar now seemed suffocating. Her thoughts raced. Mr. Carter, she was certain now that the young man was someone important, someone with power. But what power? Was he a wealthy donor? A city official? It didn't make sense. He didn't look like anyone she'd expect to have that kind of status. She stood up, her legs a bit shaky as she moved toward the back of the library, almost instinctively. She needed to know more, but as she rounded the corner, she stopped short. A familiar voice, deeper now, came from one of the men accompanying Mr. Carter. "The board is waiting for you in the meeting room. They're eager to discuss the new plans for the library." Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. The library board? Was he connected to that? Her stomach churned as the pieces began to fit together in an unsettling way. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mr. Carter wasn't just some rich donor or a random business person. He was connected to the very system she'd worked within for years. What if he owned the system? The thought hit her like a lightning bolt, a cold wave of realization flooding over her. She had just scolded the person who could own every library in the city. But why hadn't she recognized him? She prided herself on knowing the regulars, the donors, the people who kept the place running smoothly. She'd never seen this young man at any of the library meetings, never even heard his name. Was it possible he had only recently come into the role? No matter how she tried to reason with herself, the sinking feeling in her stomach wouldn't go away. She had acted as if she were the one in control, the one who knew the rules, the one who held the power. But she had been completely wrong. She had no idea who she was dealing with. As the realization settled in, Mrs. Thompson stood motionless in the hallway, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. The young man she had so easily dismissed was, in fact, the person who could change everything about the library, including her job. In that moment, she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. It was too late to take back her words. She'd made a mistake, a big one, and now she was facing the consequences of her arrogance. She had no idea how this would play out, but one thing was certain. Her life at this library would never be the same again. Mrs. Thompson lingered in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, her mind spinning with the weight of the revelation. The library, her sanctuary for so many years, suddenly felt like an unfamiliar place. The silence she had once cherished now felt like a suffocating reminder of her mistake. She couldn't help but replay the moment over and over again. What had she been thinking? She had acted with such certainty, such arrogance, assuming she was in charge, that she never considered the possibility that the young man sitting across from her wasn't just another student. But now she knew the truth. He wasn't just any student. He was Mr. Carter, the owner of the entire library system, or at least a powerful figure connected to it. As she stood there, trying to calm her racing thoughts, the door to the back meeting room creaked open. Mrs. Thompson's heart jumped in her chest as the man in the suit who had escorted Mr. Carter earlier stepped out, his eyes briefly meeting hers. He didn't smile this time. He merely nodded, as though acknowledging her presence, but his expression was unreadable. The door closed softly behind him, and Mrs. Thompson could hear the low murmur of voices from inside. She wanted to know what was being said, what was happening in that meeting, but she knew she had no right to be involved anymore. She had been cast out of that world the moment she raised her voice at Mr. Carter. But something was gnawing at her. What was the meeting about? Why had Mr. Carter even been at the library today? She hadn't noticed any big events planned, no special announcements. But then again, she hadn't been paying attention to the right things. Her focus had always been on the small, day-to-day details, keeping the library quiet, maintaining order. She had never once thought about the bigger picture, the people who were really pulling the strings. As she walked back to her desk, she noticed a few patrons glancing over at her, their eyes flicking between her and the back room. It was as if they had caught wind of something unusual, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just become the center of a story. The news would spread, she knew it. The quiet whispers would become louder. People would talk about how Mrs. Thompson, the librarian who had always upheld the rules, had publicly scolded the owner of the library system for reading too loudly. It would be the talk of the library for days. And who knew how far the ripple effect would reach beyond these walls? She could already imagine the gossip that would spread through the local community, how she had embarrassed herself in front of someone so influential. Her reputation, carefully built over the years, was now at risk. What would happen if Mr. Carter decided to make an example of her? What if he was the type to hold grudges? For the first time in her career, Mrs. Thompson felt truly powerless. She wasn't in charge of the library anymore. She wasn't the authority figure who maintained order. She was just another employee, just another person in the system, at the mercy of someone far more important than she could have ever imagined. As she sat down at her desk, her hands shook slightly, but she tried to steady them. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not here, not now. But in her heart, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the library felt different now, heavy with the weight of her own uncertainty. She glanced at the clock. Noon. Lunch hour was approaching, and patrons would soon begin to trickle in. Her job, her daily routine, it all seemed so trivial compared to what had just happened. The young man, Mr. Carter, was part of a world she didn't fully understand. And no matter how hard she tried to put it out of her mind, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the consequences of her actions were only just beginning. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Mrs. Thompson. She tried to carry on with her usual duties, shelving books, answering a few questions from patrons, and making sure the library remained quiet. But it all felt meaningless now. The weight of her earlier mistake hung over her, pulling her attention in 1,000 directions. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Carter and the implications of what had just happened. By late afternoon, the library was quieter than usual, with only a few patrons scattered throughout the aisles. Mrs. Thompson was shelving a row of books near the back corner when she noticed a familiar figure standing in the doorway of her office. It was the man in the suit, the one who had accompanied Mr. Carter earlier. He was standing there, waiting for her to notice him. Her heart sank, and her palms suddenly felt clammy. She hadn't expected to see him again. What could he want? What more could she possibly do to make things worse? The man cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice polite but firm. "Mr. Carter would like to speak with you." The words sent a shockwave through her. "Mr. Carter wants to speak with me?" Her mind raced, thinking through all the possible scenarios. Would he reprimand her? Would she be fired? What would he even want to say to her after the way she had treated him earlier? But before she could speak, the man continued. "Don't worry. He just wants to clear the air. There's no need to be anxious." Mrs. Thompson swallowed hard, trying to regain her composure. "Clear the air?" she repeated, her voice sounding weaker than she intended. The man nodded. "Yes, Mr. Carter doesn't hold grudges. He simply believes in understanding the full picture before making any decisions." His eyes softened slightly, though the sternness never fully left his expression. "Please, come with me." As they walked down the narrow hallway toward the meeting room, Mrs. Thompson's mind raced with questions. What was Mr. Carter going to say? Did he have a point to prove? Or was this just a polite way of telling her she had overstepped? She had no idea, but she felt like a deer caught in headlights. The hallway felt longer than usual, every step echoing in her mind as she tried to prepare herself for whatever conversation awaited her. When they reached the door, the man in the suit opened it for her, and Mrs. Thompson stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was small, almost cozy, with a round table in the center. Mr. Carter was sitting at one end, looking completely relaxed, as if he hadn't just been the subject of a public confrontation only hours before. His presence, calm and authoritative, seemed to fill the space despite his casual posture. "Please, have a seat," he said with a smile that was both welcoming and mysterious. Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from him. She wasn't sure if she should speak first or wait for him to say something, but the silence between them was palpable. Finally, Mr. Carter broke it. "You must be wondering why I asked to speak with you after what happened earlier today," he said, his voice smooth and confident. Mrs. Thompson nodded, feeling a tightness in her throat. She was still unsure how to address the situation. Should she apologize? Should she try to explain herself? "I know you were just doing your job," Mr. Carter continued, his tone unexpectedly kind. "I understand the pressure of maintaining order in a place like this. It's not always easy. But I also think that sometimes people forget that the rules aren't the whole picture." His words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. Mrs. Thompson had always prided herself on being strict, on keeping everything running smoothly, but it was true. She had never really stopped to think about who she was enforcing those rules for, or why she was so quick to assume the worst in people. "I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable," he said as though reading her mind. "And I certainly didn't mean to make you feel threatened. It was never about power. It's about understanding the bigger picture." Mrs. Thompson blinked, trying to process his words. Understanding the bigger picture? He leaned forward slightly. "This library, the entire system, is a lot more than just a place for books. It's a community, a space for learning, for growing. Sometimes those who work behind the scenes, like yourself, can forget that it's not always about maintaining silence or following every rule to the letter. It's about creating an environment where people can thrive, even when they're a little out of line sometimes." His words weren't what she had expected. She'd thought he would scold her, reprimand her for her actions, but instead he was explaining his perspective with a calm understanding that made her feel almost embarrassed. Mrs. Thompson sat back in her chair, the weight of his words settling in. She had been so focused on maintaining control, so preoccupied with upholding the library's rules, that she hadn't stopped to consider the human side of things. Maybe, just maybe, Mr. Carter was right. As the conversation continued, Mrs. Thompson began to realize that this encounter, this mistake, might not have been the end of her career at the library after all. Maybe it was a wake-up call, a reminder that there was more to being a librarian than just enforcing silence. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to rethink her approach. As Mr. Carter spoke, Mrs. Thompson's mind was beginning to shift. He wasn't scolding her, wasn't angry. He was trying to open her eyes to something bigger, something she hadn't considered in all her years of working at the library. She had always believed that keeping the space quiet and orderly was the key to a successful library. But he was showing her another side, one that valued community, understanding, and even a bit of chaos. She felt a flicker of shame. It wasn't that she hadn't cared about people, it was that her methods had always been about control. She had never allowed herself to think beyond that narrow lens. But then, just as she was starting to process what he was saying, Mr. Carter's tone changed. He paused, looking at her with an unreadable expression before leaning forward. His voice dropped a little, as though what he was about to say was something more serious. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his gaze steady, "I came here today not just to clear the air, but to offer you something. A chance to be a part of something bigger than what you're used to." I think you have the potential to do more than just manage a library. You've spent your career keeping the peace, maintaining order, but I believe you could help change things for the better." Mrs. Thompson blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Change things?" He smiled slightly, as though he had been expecting her question. "The library system is growing, evolving. We're looking to modernize, to make it more than just a place for books. It's going to be a community hub, a space where people can come together, learn, collaborate, and I want you to be a part of that vision." The words hit her like a wave. She had spent years working in this library, following the same routines day after day, yet here was a man, the man, telling her she had the chance to be a part of something new, something different. It was hard to comprehend. "You're talking about more than just keeping the shelves stocked," she said slowly, her voice trembling with the weight of the offer. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "I want you to help lead this transformation, not as the strict enforcer of rules, but as someone who understands how a library can be a place of inspiration, a place where people can connect in ways that go beyond the books themselves. You've seen how people interact in this space, how they rely on the library for more than just quiet reading. You can guide that process, help us rethink the way this system works." The idea seemed almost impossible, too big for someone like her. Mrs. Thompson had always thought of herself as just a librarian, someone who kept the books in order and made sure the rules were followed. But now, the possibility of becoming part of something revolutionary, something larger than herself, was right in front of her. "But I don't know how," she admitted, feeling a wave of self-doubt wash over her. "I've spent my career following the rules. I've never really been in charge of anything more than what happens here in these walls." Mr. Carter's eyes softened. "That's why I'm offering this to you. You have the experience. You know how the system works from the inside. What you need is a new perspective, a fresh way of thinking about what a library can be. You're not alone in this. You'll have a team, support, and most importantly, the freedom to create something new, something meaningful." Mrs. Thompson sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the offer. She had always believed that libraries were sacred, that they were meant to remain untouched by the outside world. But now she was being asked to step into a role she had never imagined for herself. A role that involved change, growth, and perhaps a little risk. "I don't know," she said, her voice quiet. "It sounds like a big leap. I've spent so many years keeping things just the way they are. I'm not sure I'm ready for something so different." Mr. Carter smiled again, this time with a touch of understanding. "You don't have to be ready. That's the point. This isn't about being perfect. It's about evolving, and I think you're more than capable of helping us lead that change." For a long moment, Mrs. Thompson didn't speak. She was still processing the weight of the decision in front of her. The thought of leaving behind the routine, the control, the quiet safety of her old life was terrifying. But there was also something thrilling about it, a chance to make a real impact, to shape the future of the library system. It felt like standing on the edge of something unknown, with only one choice ahead: to take the leap or stay on solid ground. She took a deep breath, feeling a new kind of clarity settling in her chest. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice more certain than it had been moments ago. "But thank you for giving me the opportunity to even consider it." Mr. Carter nodded as if he had expected her to say that. "Take your time," he said. This isn't something you need to decide overnight, but know that we want you to be part of this new chapter. You've got more potential than you realize." As she left the room, Mrs. Thompson's mind was buzzing with possibilities. The library, her library, was on the verge of a transformation. And whether she took the offer or not, one thing was clear. Her world had just shifted in ways she could never have predicted. The next few days felt like a blur for Mrs. Thompson. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Carter's offer. The more she replayed their conversation in her mind, the more appealing it seemed, but at the same time, the more terrifying it became. She had always lived her life in the quiet, controlled corners of the library, keeping things neat, orderly, and predictable. This new vision, this transformation Mr. Carter had described, felt like a leap into a world she didn't fully understand. She spent hours walking the library's halls, trying to picture what it might look like if it weren't just a place for books and silence. What would it look like if it became a hub for collaboration, for learning, for creativity? She couldn't deny the excitement that had stirred within her when he spoke about the possibilities. The thought of the library being a place where people connected, shared ideas, and grew together, it sounded like something truly meaningful. But still, she couldn't shake the uncertainty. She was scared. Scared of failure, scared of change. She had always been good at maintaining order, at making sure the library ran smoothly according to the rules. She'd never had to think beyond that framework. The idea of throwing that all away, of stepping into a role that required more risk and imagination, felt almost reckless. But it wasn't just the fear of the unknown that held her back. It was the fear of losing what she had worked so hard to build. Her reputation, her identity within the library system. It was all based on her ability to enforce the rules. Would she lose her place in the community if she changed too much? What would her colleagues think? Would they respect her if she wasn't the strict, reliable librarian they had always known? One morning, as she sat at her desk reviewing the schedule for the day, she noticed a group of students talking near the front of the library. They were laughing, passing around books, discussing ideas. Mrs. Thompson had always discouraged talking in the library, but today, instead of feeling irritated, she found herself watching them with interest. They weren't being loud or disruptive. They were engaging with the material in a way she had never considered before. They were using the library to connect, not just to read. The realization hit her. This is what Mr. Carter was talking about. The library wasn't just a place for solitary, quiet reading. It was a space that could bring people together, could foster creativity, could change lives. It was more than just a set of rules. It was a living, breathing environment. She stood up and walked over to the group of students, her heart pounding. She had never approached students like this before, but today felt different. She smiled at them, a small but genuine smile, and said, "I see you're all having a good discussion. Keep it up, but try to keep it down a little, all right? We want everyone to enjoy the space." The students smiled back, acknowledging her with a friendly nod. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson," one of them said, her voice quieter but still full of energy. As Mrs. Thompson walked away, she felt something shift within her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to control the situation. She didn't feel the pressure to shut them down or keep them in line. Instead, she felt a sense of pride that they were using the library in a way that made it come alive. It wasn't perfect. There was still a need for some level of order, but it was a step forward. It was a glimpse of what could be. Later that afternoon, as she sat back at her desk, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Mr. Carter. I just wanted to check in. Have you had any time to think about our conversation? I know it's a big decision, but I want you to know we're here to support you." Mrs. Thompson stared at the message for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. She felt a mix of emotions: fear, excitement, uncertainty. She had never made a decision like this before. After a long pause, she typed a response. "I've been thinking a lot about it, and I'm ready to give it a try. Let's make this library something people can connect with, something more than just a place for quiet reading." She hit send before she could second guess herself, and then sat back, a weight lifting off her shoulders. The decision wasn't easy, but it felt right. Mrs. Thompson had made a choice. She was ready to embrace change, to leave behind the safety of rules and routine, and to step into a new role, one that might just change the course of her life and the future of the library. The quiet after the decision felt different this time. It wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind. Mrs. Thompson, now fully committed to embracing Mr. Carter's vision for the library, found herself stepping into a new, unfamiliar role. The transition wasn't easy. It was hard to let go of the familiar routine she had followed for years. At first, she felt like a fish out of water, unsure of how to balance her old habits with the new direction she was being asked to take. She spent more time with Mr. Carter and the team he had assembled for the library's transformation. They discussed new ideas, new programs, and new ways of engaging with the community. There was talk of creating spaces for workshops, hosting events for local creators, even introducing interactive digital tools that would allow people to collaborate online as well as in person. The focus wasn't just on books anymore. It was about fostering a space where people could come together, share knowledge, and build relationships. At first, Mrs. Thompson was skeptical. It was hard to imagine the library transforming into something so dynamic and collaborative. She had always believed that the beauty of a library was in its quiet solitude, in the peaceful moments when you could lose yourself in a book without any distractions. But as she worked more closely with the team, she began to see how those new ideas could complement what the library had always been. The goal wasn't to abandon the tradition of quiet reading. It was to expand the library's purpose, to include a more diverse range of activities while still respecting the space that made the library unique. One of the first changes was the introduction of community book clubs and discussion groups. These were casual gatherings where people could come together to talk about their favorite books, ideas, and experiences. Mrs. Thompson was nervous at first, unsure of how the regular library goers would react. She knew that not everyone would be thrilled about the change, especially those who preferred the calm and silence that had defined the library for years. But, to her surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. More and more people started showing up, eager to join the discussions and share their thoughts. The energy in the library began to shift. It was still quiet at times, of course, but there was a new kind of hum in the air, one that wasn't about silence but about connection. Mrs. Thompson began to let go of the fear that had held her back for so long. She no longer felt the pressure to control every interaction, to enforce every rule. She began to embrace the idea that a library could be a place for both quiet reflection and lively exchange. She started to spend more time engaging with the patrons, talking to them about their ideas and encouraging them to participate in the new programs. The library was becoming a living, breathing part of the community, and she was starting to love every moment of it. But it wasn't just the community that was changing. Mrs. Thompson herself was evolving. She had always seen herself as the enforcer of order, the keeper of silence. But now she was a facilitator, someone who helped others connect, learn, and grow. She realized that she didn't need to be a figure of authority to make a difference. She could be a guide, someone who nurtured the space where ideas could flourish. One evening, after a particularly successful book club discussion, Mrs. Thompson sat at her desk, watching the last few patrons leave the library. The place felt different, fuller somehow, not in a crowded, overwhelming way, but in a way that felt alive with possibilities. It was no longer just a space for solitary study. It had become a place of shared experiences, a hub for creativity and connection. As she looked around, she thought about how far she had come. Just a few months ago, she had been stuck in the rigidity of rules and silence, unsure of how to move forward. But now, she could see the library in a completely new light. She had made the decision to step outside of her comfort zone, to embrace change, and it had paid off in ways she hadn't imagined. A few days later, Mr. Carter stopped by for a visit, just as he had promised. He walked through the library, taking in the changes that had already begun to take shape. When he reached Mrs. Thompson's desk, he smiled at her warmly. "You've done amazing work here," he said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "This place is becoming exactly what we hoped for." Mrs. Thompson smiled back, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. "Thank you. It's been a lot of work, but I'm starting to see it. How this place can really bring people together." Mr. Carter nodded, his eyes twinkling with approval. "I knew you had it in you. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and this is only the beginning. We've got so many more ideas to explore." As he left, Mrs. Thompson sat back in her chair, reflecting on everything that had happened. She had made a choice, and that choice had led her down a path of growth and transformation. The library was changing, but so was she. She was no longer just the strict librarian. She was a leader in the community, a part of something much bigger than herself. The future of the library was wide open, and for the first time in years, Mrs. Thompson felt excited about what was to come. Apologies for the misunderstanding. I'll continue with the story you've requested, completing the script in the 14 to 15 sections as we initially planned. I will now proceed with the next section of the library story. Let's continue from where we left off. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Thompson's transformation became more evident. She spent her days working alongside the new team, attending meetings with Mr. Carter, and slowly learning to embrace the changes that were happening within the library. Each new initiative, from hosting local author talks to setting up collaborative workspaces, felt like a step forward, but also a departure from the quiet, solitary place she had once loved so much. The change wasn't just external. Mrs. Thompson noticed that her interactions with the patrons were different. She found herself smiling more, engaging with people who had once been nothing more than faces passing by in the stacks. She was no longer just the librarian who kept everything in order. She was a part of the community. She began to see her role in a new light, not as someone who maintained silence, but as someone who could help shape the library into a place where ideas and connections flourished. One afternoon, as she was helping a group of students set up for a small workshop, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The first few days of change had been overwhelming. She had questioned whether she was making the right decision, whether she was losing the essence of what made the library special. But now, as she watched these students eagerly discussing their ideas, something clicked. This was what the library was meant to be, a space that adapted to the needs of the people it served. It was never meant to be static, to be confined to a set of rules. It was a living, evolving entity, shaped by the community it nurtured. And Mrs. Thompson, for the first time, felt like she was truly a part of that. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Mr. Carter walking toward her, a broad smile on his face. "You've done wonders here," he said, his voice full of approval. "I can't tell you how impressed I am with the changes you've made." Mrs. Thompson felt a small blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. It's still a work in progress, but I think we're getting there." "Getting there?" he repeated with a chuckle. "You've already done more than I could have hoped for. The community is responding. I'm hearing nothing but good things. People are excited about what's happening here." His words filled her with a sense of pride. For so long, she had been caught in the rigidity of rules, convinced that the library's purpose was to remain a quiet, controlled space. But now, as she stood in the middle of this bustling, creative hub, she could see that Mr. Carter was right. The library was more than just a building with books. It was a place of connection, growth, and possibility. "I'm just getting started," she said with a smile, her confidence growing. "There's still so much more we can do." Mr. Carter's smile widened. "That's the spirit. I'm glad we took this journey together. And remember, you're not alone in this. You've got the full support of the team behind you." As he walked away, Mrs. Thompson stood there for a moment, taking it all in. She had never imagined that she would be the one leading such a transformation. The journey had been difficult at times, but it had also been one of the most rewarding experiences of her career. The library was no longer just a place of silence. It was a vibrant community, constantly evolving to meet the needs of the people who walked through its doors. And Mrs. Thompson, for the first time, felt truly at home in it. She smiled to herself, knowing that this was only the beginning. The library's future was bright, and she was ready to be a part of it, one chapter at a time. As the library continued to evolve, Mrs. Thompson found herself facing new challenges. The success of the recent initiatives had created a sense of excitement in the community, but with that came higher expectations. More and more patrons were coming to the library for the new events and programs, and as the crowds grew, so did the demands. One afternoon, as Mrs. Thompson was overseeing a group of young adults working on a community art project in the newly designated creative space, she overheard a heated conversation near the front desk. Two patrons were arguing loudly. One was asking for assistance with an outdated system for reserving library materials, while the other was frustrated by the noise level in the room. Mrs. Thompson moved quickly to intervene, as she had always done in situations like this. She approached the desk, offering a polite but firm greeting. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between the two patrons, both visibly upset. The woman who had been complaining about the noise spoke first. "Yes, I'm trying to get some work done, and this space is far too noisy for me to concentrate. I come here to read, not to be surrounded by distractions." Mrs. Thompson turned to the other patron, the one who had been asking about the outdated system. "And you?" she asked. The man, a regular who had been using the library's resources for years, looked sheepish. "I'm just trying to reserve a few books for my class, but this system, it's old. It's not easy to use, and I'm getting frustrated." Mrs. Thompson's mind began to race. She had seen both of these issues before. The noise in the newly designated spaces had been a concern since the community program started. Some patrons, particularly those who had been using the library as a quiet space for years, weren't happy with the increased activity. And as for the reservation system, it was something she knew had been a long-standing issue, but there hadn't been enough resources to update it. She took a deep breath. This was her test, the first real challenge since the library's transformation had begun. She couldn't afford to go back to the old, rigid ways of dealing with conflict. This situation required balance and empathy, not just rules. She turned to the woman first. "I understand your frustration," Mrs. Thompson said kindly, though her tone was firm. "This space is meant to be a place of creativity and collaboration, but I also understand that not everyone prefers this environment. If you'd like, I can direct you to one of our quieter areas where you can work without distraction." The woman looked at her, still annoyed but somewhat placated by Mrs. Thompson's calm response. "I suppose that would be fine," she muttered, still a bit put off but willing to move to a quieter corner. Turning to the man, Mrs. Thompson spoke again, this time more directly. "As for the reservation system, I'm aware that it's outdated, and we've been working on getting it updated. In the meantime, I can personally assist you with reserving the books you need. It's not ideal, but I want to make sure you have what you need for your class." The man's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you," he said, still a little frustrated but appreciative of the personal attention. As the situation began to diffuse, Mrs. Thompson felt a quiet sense of pride. She had managed to handle both patrons without resorting to old habits, without making either of them feel like their concerns were being dismissed. She had listened, understood, and offered solutions, all while maintaining the sense of warmth and openness that had become the new heart of the library. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and it was moments like these, when she could balance the needs of the community with the library's evolving mission, that made her realize just how far she had come. She no longer felt like the enforcer of rules. She felt like a guide, someone who could help lead the library through its transformation without losing sight of what made it valuable in the first place. Later that afternoon, as Mrs. Thompson walked through the library, she noticed how seamlessly the new changes were starting to blend with the old. People were still reading quietly in the back corners, while others were engaged in lively discussions or working on creative projects. The once rigid line between quiet and loud was starting to blur, and the library was becoming a more inclusive, dynamic place because of it. She smiled to herself. The road to transformation hadn't been easy, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. As the months went by, the transformation of the library under Mrs. Thompson's leadership became more and more visible. What had once been a quiet, traditional space dedicated solely to books and solitary study was now a vibrant community hub. The library was bustling with energy, people of all ages coming together for workshops, book clubs, art exhibits, and community discussions. It was a far cry from the rigid environment Mrs. Thompson had once maintained. One afternoon, while overseeing a local artist's gallery exhibit in the main reading room, Mrs. Thompson had the chance to witness firsthand how much the community was embracing the changes. A young girl and her mother stood in front of a large canvas, discussing the vibrant colors of the painting, while an elderly couple looked at a series of photographs by a local photographer, exchanging quiet words about the subject's expressions. Mrs. Thompson was busy helping set up for an upcoming event when she overheard a conversation near the newly established community bulletin board. Two patrons, one a longtime library regular and the other a new visitor, were discussing the transformation. "You know, I didn't expect much when they started these community events," the regular said, adjusting his glasses. "But I have to admit, it's changed the whole vibe around here. I never thought I'd see the day when the library would host a local author reading, or when people would come together like this, It feels like a real part of the community now." The new visitor, a middle-aged woman who had been coming in to attend the writing workshops, smiled. "I agree. I was hesitant at first, but the workshops have really helped me with my writing. I never knew how much I was missing by not engaging with others. It's opened up a whole new world for me." Mrs. Thompson, who had been listening from a distance, felt a quiet sense of satisfaction settle in her chest. The community was responding to the changes, embracing the new purpose of the library. The once solitary space was now a place where people came not just to read, but to share, to learn, and to grow. Later, after the artist's exhibit concluded and the patrons began to leave, Mrs. Thompson sat in the now empty room, reflecting on the journey. She thought back to the days when she had felt uncertain about the library's transformation. She had worried about losing the essence of what made the space special, about disrupting the peace and quiet that many patrons, including herself, had cherished for so long. But now, looking at the gallery walls, seeing the smiles and animated conversations of the people who had participated in the events, she realized that the library had become more than she had ever imagined. It was a place where art, creativity, and education intersected. A place where people of all backgrounds could come together and exchange ideas, whether through a casual book discussion, a hands-on crafting session, or a meaningful conversation about a painting. The library had evolved into something greater than just a building full of books. It had become a living, breathing part of the community. As the evening sun streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow on the library's wooden floors, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what she had hoped for. The library had not only survived the changes, but thrived in them. The transformation had been difficult, but it had been worth every step. She felt proud of what she and the team had accomplished, and she knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't just the space that had changed, it was the people, herself included. She was no longer just the librarian who enforced rules and maintained silence. She had become a part of something bigger, a catalyst for change, a facilitator of community, and a leader in the library's ongoing evolution. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text message from Mr. Carter. "Great work today. The community is really starting to take notice. Let's catch up next week to discuss the next phase of our vision." Mrs. Thompson smiled to herself. The work wasn't done yet, but they were moving in the right direction. The road ahead was still long, but she felt ready for whatever came next. As the library's transformation progressed, Mrs. Thompson found herself stepping into a new rhythm. She had embraced her evolving role as a community leader, and the library was thriving in ways she never imagined possible. But with success came new challenges. The more the community engaged with the library, the more diverse the needs became. And now, it was time for the next big step: expansion. Mr. Carter had been discussing the idea of opening a second location in a nearby town, one that would replicate the success they had found in their original library. It would be a larger space, with even more room for community programs, art galleries, workshops, and collaborative spaces. The idea was thrilling, but also daunting. It meant taking the lessons learned from the first location and scaling them to fit a new community with its own unique needs and challenges. One afternoon, Mrs. Thompson sat down with Mr. Carter and the team to discuss the plans. The mood in the room was a mix of excitement and nervous energy. They had come so far, but now they were about to take a huge leap. "We've seen incredible success here," Mr. Carter began, "but we have to be honest with ourselves. The new location won't be without its hurdles. We're talking about expanding to an area where the community doesn't know us yet. We need to make sure we're building on what we've already created, but adapting to a new environment. Mrs. Thompson listened carefully, absorbing every word. She had been through the transformation of their first library, and while it had been challenging, it had also been one of the most rewarding experiences of her life. But this was different. This time, they would have to build from the ground up. They wouldn't have the luxury of easing into the changes like they had before. "I think we're ready," she said, her voice firm. "The key is to stay true to our values while also listening to the new community. We'll need to be flexible, but we also have to make sure we're creating a space where people can truly connect. It's not just about books anymore. It's about fostering a space for people to engage, collaborate, and grow." Mr. Carter nodded, clearly impressed by her confidence. "Exactly. We're not just opening another library. We're opening a space that will help define the future of learning, creativity, and community building, and I think you're the right person to help lead that vision." As the meeting wrapped up, Mrs. Thompson walked out of the conference room with a renewed sense of purpose. The task ahead would be enormous, but she felt ready. She had learned so much during the past few months, and now it was time to take those lessons and apply them to something even bigger. The second location wouldn't just be a replica of the first. It would be an opportunity to refine their vision, to make the library even more accessible, even more inclusive. For the first time in her career, Mrs. Thompson wasn't just managing a library. She was building the future of it. The grand opening of the second location was scheduled for the following summer, but before that, there was still much to be done. Mrs. Thompson found herself balancing the responsibilities of both the original library and the new location's development. The work was demanding, but it was also invigorating. The excitement in the air was palpable, and the whole team, from the staff to the community members, rallied behind the idea of something even greater than what they had already built. As the project moved forward, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She remembered the days when she was hesitant to change, when she thought that maintaining the silence and order of the library was the most important thing. She thought back to that first conversation with Mr. Carter, when he had asked her to step outside her comfort zone and embrace a new vision. She never could have imagined that it would lead to this, leading the charge and redefining what a library could be, not just in one location, but across an entire community. One afternoon, as she walked through the original library, she paused in the main reading room. It was quieter than usual, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. There were still patrons reading, students studying, and people working on their laptops. But the air felt different. It felt full, not just of people, but of possibility. Mrs. Thompson stood there for a moment, soaking it all in. She had come full circle. The library was no longer just a place of silence and solitude. It had become a dynamic, living space where people connected, learned, and shared ideas. It was a place where change had been embraced, and where the community had grown stronger because of it. As the door to the library opened and a new group of visitors walked in, Mrs. Thompson smiled to herself. The library's transformation wasn't just about the programs, the art, or the new spaces. It was about the people. And that, she realized, was what made it all worthwhile. The future was bright, and she was ready to lead the way. A year later, the second location was thriving. The community had embraced the new library just as warmly as the original one, and Mrs. Thompson had proven herself to be the catalyst for a new era in library development. The success of the first location had been replicated, but with fresh ideas and a commitment to meeting the needs of a different community. As she stood before a new group of library employees at the second location's annual team meeting, Mrs. Thompson felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She wasn't the same person who had been so unsure of herself when Mr. Carter first approached her. She had evolved, just as the library had, and now she was proud of the impact she had made, not just on the spaces she managed, but on the lives of the people who walked through those doors. "I never imagined I would be standing here leading two incredible libraries," she said to the team, her voice filled with gratitude. "But here we are, together, creating something special. I couldn't be prouder of everything we've achieved, and I'm so excited for what the future holds." As the team applauded, Mrs. Thompson looked out over the room, feeling a sense of fulfillment. The libraries had become more than just buildings. They had become the heart of the community, and she had helped shape that transformation. The journey had been long, and at times it had been difficult, but in the end, Mrs. Thompson knew one thing for certain. The library had become a place of connection, a place of learning, and a place of growth. And she had been a part of that change every step of the way. With a smile on her face, she turned to face the future, knowing that the best was yet to come.